At the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, three pivotal forces in geopolitics began to collapse: the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and the Chinese Empire. Contrary to Western beliefs then, after these three empires fell, more pro-Western forces would not necessarily take power. What actually happened was exactly the opposite. At first, chaos reigned, bringing violence and hunger to the entire Eurasian region. And then, in the power vacuum left by those three empires, dark and totalitarian forces emerged that nearly brought about global annihilation. And let's draw a parallel between the turn from the 19th to the 20th century and the present day. After all, following the fall of Syria and Iraq, it's quite likely that we'll see the fall of other governments in the Middle East, especially Turkey, Iran, and maybe even Saudi Arabia. This may seem unthinkable today, but make no mistake, the chances are high. Especially as these countries fall into the risk of a demographic crisis, as well as becoming victims of the deglobalization process we're witnessing. So, in the next 20 or 30 years, what happened back then could happen again, and that's quite dangerous. That's why let's take a look at how that transition happened back then compared to today's transition, examining the consequences for the future. I'm Geopolitical Mundial, and this is the channel. Before that, don't forget to subscribe, don't forget to comment, don't forget to like, and don't forget to share the video with everyone you know. Sharing the video helps keep the Geopolitical Mundial channel alive. YouTube has basically thrown this channel away and swept it under the rug. YouTube hides this channel, so your support is very important. More than you can imagine. I'm Geopolitical Mundial, and this is my channel. What's up? In the early 20th century, Siberia, Mongolia, and Central Asia became the scene of geopolitical turmoil that led to violence from 1917 to 1921. With massacres, sexual crimes, torture, dismemberment, rivers filled with corpses, and armed gangs ravaging the steppes. The civil war between the Reds, Bolsheviks, and anti-revolutionary whites turned the region into a scene worthy of post-apocalyptic movies, with planes setting villages on fire, armored trains crossing the steppes, and killers on the loose, evoking a dark mythology. This barbarity had deep roots: the Russian conquest of Siberia since the 16th century, the cultural fusion between Russians, Cossacks, nomadic peoples, Mongolic, Chinese, and Koreans. Combined with Japanese expansionism and the imminent collapse of China, followed by the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Turkish Empire, it was the perfect recipe for hell. A vast, hybrid, and almost ungovernable space was formed, ideal for anarchy and banditry. Siberia, comparable in size to Australia, stretches from the Urals to the Pacific, and in the region of Lake Baikal, surrounded by the Yablonovi, Udokan, and Stanovoy mountains, it has a Mongolic historical and cultural core. This area, the cradle of pastoral societies and skilled warriors, shaped ethnic groups and nomadic traditions descended from the cultural forces that influenced Genghis Khan a millennium earlier. And here it's important to remember that unlike other marginal powers, the Russian Empire did not have the option of creating overseas colonies. So, they had to make a different decision. They decided to colonize the region of Eurasia. This was a major geopolitical shift, as the Russian people had previously always been victims of Central Asian nomads. But now they were going to change that equation, mainly thanks to the Industrial Revolution, by conquering these peoples. So, from being attacked, they became the aggressors, mainly trying to reach the Pacific region by land. A very profound change in the geopolitics of the 19th century, which still has consequences today. Thus, from the end of the 16th century, the Khazaris set out to conquer Heartland, the Eurasian continental heartland, driven by the desire for riches and the fear of the Tatar threat. In 1580, Cossack expeditions, backed by Ivan the Terrible, crossed Siberian rivers using extreme violence. Massacres were committed, there was slavery, deadly epidemics occurred, and there was also a heavy imposition of tribute in Palace. And this expansion also served to drain the unwanted layers of Russian society, such as Cossacks, rebels, deserters, criminals, and political opponents, perpetuating marginality on the new frontiers. And in the 17th century, the establishment of military posts near Baikal consolidated Russian control and attracted nomadic peoples under protection against the threat. Manchu from China. The Treaty of Nerchinsk of 1689 defined the border with China. And the construction of the Great Siberian Route and the Tea Road turned cities like Irkutsk into true regional commercial hubs. Cossack society in Siberia was isolated by hundreds of kilometers of taiga, distancing itself from strict Russian orthodoxy and incorporating Lamist and Buddhist practices. They married local women and took on hybrid traits while still maintaining their warrior vocation. Something very different from the Western Cossacks in the Volga region, who had more compact and collective social structures. Here in Siberia, the Siberian Cossacks received individual salaries, had the right to private property after 1869, and were subject to the imperial governors. And in the 19th century, this Eastern Front gained a strategic role. In 1857, the Russians, through the Amur River, forced China, weakened by the Opium War and the Taiping Rebellion, to recognize the Sino-Russian border. This led to the creation of the Amur and Ussuri hosts, whose mission eventually resulted in the founding of Vladivostok in 1860, consolidating the Russian presence in the Pacific. In parallel to this, civilian colonization advanced in waves, first with the Cossacks in the 17th century, then with the Old Believers in the 18th century and peasants in the 19th century. The latter were encouraged by the abolition of serfdom in 1861 and by promises of land, tax exemption, and exemption from military service. But even so, Siberia maintained an almost medieval daily life, with the exception of a few centers like Irkutsk and Chita. Another pillar of occupation was forced exile, because since 1754, common criminals, political prisoners, and dissidents were sent to work in mines, plantations, and in remote villages of the region. Although exiled intellectuals after the Decembrist Revolt of 1825 or the Polish Uprising of 1863 even contributed some cultural capital, the majority in general was made up of peasants accused of vague offenses and very violent criminals. This social composition, combined with the presence of Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese in the Far East, created a multi-ethnic and multicultural society full of tensions and structural violence. Escaping state control, deserters and exiles infested the forests, forming armed bands that terrorized the villages. But something would actually change with the turn of the century, which brought a decisive instrument, the Trans-Siberian Railway. Started in 1891 and completed in 1903, it connected St. Petersburg to Vladivostok with a strategic detour through Manchuria. It was more than just an economic route. It was a geopolitical axis meant to integrate the Russian Empire and project power over Asia. The Manchurian branch, where the Chinese Eastern Railway was located, cut through Chinese territory, exploiting the weakness of the Qin dynasty, which was undermined by famine, corruption, the Opium War, and the Taiping Rebellion. But the change wasn't just the integration that the railway brought with the Russian geopolitical core, it was also because it triggered conflicts. Its presence in China, along with Russian military incursions in northeastern China and the massacre of 5,000 Chinese. During the suppression of the Boxer Rebellion, it inflamed nationalist hatred and planted the seeds for future wars. During this same period, Mongolia emerged as the pivot of the Great Game, the Russo-British struggle for the Eurasian continental heartland. I've discussed this on the channel before, and you should watch it to understand the past and current geopolitical context. I'll leave the link in the video description because it shows how this Great Game context still exists today. And Mongolia, despite extreme chronic poverty and theocratic feudalism, its strategic position and ties with Tibet attracted the major powers. A monk from that era, advisor to the 13th Dalai Lama, viewed Russia as protection from the British and Chinese. Alarmed, London sent a military expedition against Tibet in 1903, occupying Lhasa in 1904 and forcing an agreement that reaffirmed Chinese sovereignty. Russia, humiliated by its defeat to Japan, stayed on the sidelines until the 1911 revolution overthrew the Qin dynasty, plunging China into absolute chaos. In December, princes and lamas proclaimed the independence of Outer Mongolia, crowning Bogi Khan as the theocratic leader. But without the means to sustain the new state, mired in poverty, superstition, and aristocratic luxury. They had no choice, they had to look for a sponsor for their sovereignty. In this vacuum, Russia and Japan competed for influence over Mongolian territory. Tokyo financed factions through secret societies. Meanwhile, Moscow, driven by pragmatism, made a secret agreement in November 1912 that recognized Mongolian autonomy and established its protection. This type of video you're watching has very dense, very technical content, and therefore the vast majority of YouTube users aren't interested. Maybe that's why YouTube shadow bans my channel. So, this channel only exists because of the members, and also because this specific video was sponsored by BCI. And BCI, Bureau of Corporate Intelligence, is a company specialized in protecting people and businesses against fraud, cyber attacks, and espionage, including industrial espionage. Their work involves assessing the reliability of partners and employees, investigating digital crimes and irregularities within companies, as well as offering consulting to increase the security of members. And the company also assists in asset recovery in case of a crisis. It assesses risks and opportunities in new investments and tracks the political landscape to help companies make safer decisions. So, if you own a company or hold a key position in a company, such as being on the board of directors, and you're having some problem related to information gathering, or maybe you're having a problem with information leaks from your company, don't take any chances. Get in touch with BCI and they'll solve your problem and maybe even train your team so this doesn't happen again. So, if you're a company director, business owner, or need any service related to counterintelligence and intelligence, get in touch with BCI. They will help you solve your problem. This context of Chinese imperial decline, railway expansion, Japanese modernization, and internal rearrangements in Russia led to the 1917 revolution, making Central Asia and Siberia an explosive cauldron. It was in this environment, marked by fragile structures, armed ethnic groups, religious fanaticism, and imperial interests, that a true hell was unleashed from 1917 onward. A civil war that crossed borders turned the Trans-Siberian into a corridor of death and unleashed hordes of Mongol Cossacks and paramilitary bands. In a true bloodbath that marked the end of the old empire and the brutal entry of the region into the 20th century. This is where the dangerous question arises, because at the time, what we had was the collapse of three very powerful forces: the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and the Chinese Empire. And with them collapsing, we had a gigantic population. After all, these countries were not only large geographically, but they were also large demographically. They would be practically adrift amid the race of imperial geopolitical forces that were also growing. And in the midst of this confrontation, they would put pressure on that inner region of Eurasia in this dispute between them, which would cause even more chaos in the future. Because what we had was the collapse of states that had a very large geographic position and size, set on fire by radical religious movements, both from Russia and China, and also radical political movements, like the Bolsheviks. This collapse was caused mainly thanks to offensives by the Atlantic forces. In 1911, the fall of the Qin dynasty, after millennia of imperial dynastic rule, plunged the country into a period of chaos. Communists on one side, nationalists tied to drug trafficking on the other. Meanwhile, warlords and provincial leaders each controlled territories, armies, and local economies. The 1910s and 1920s were marked by continuous wars between military factions and foreign interventions. Additionally, from 1917 to 1922, the Russian Empire collapsed. The Tsarist Empire was humiliated by the war, with the Japanese Empire collapsing after World War I and the February Revolution. This created a power vacuum where central authority fragmented, administrative structures collapsed, the armed forces became disorganized, and multiple extremely violent leadership actors ended up emerging. Meanwhile, on the western edge, the Ottoman Turkish Empire collapsed after 1918, destroying the political structure that had controlled the Middle East, parts of Europe, and the Caucasus for centuries. The Treaty of Sèvres and the imposition of artificial borders by the marginal European powers, especially France and England. They created fragile states thus such as Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon without real national cohesion, laying the foundations for conflicts that would last until today. The entire region of the so-called Heartland, the Continental Heart, was under the fury of warlords armed to the teeth who committed the most violent and nefarious acts, which hadn't been seen in a long time. So between that period from 1905, 1910 until 1937, what we had in the Eurasian region was a real hell on earth, an almost dystopian region. It looked like Mad Max. And this was 1937. Not because things got better from then on, but because from 1937 we would finally have the beginning of the greatest war in human history, which was World War II. In other words, this chaotic period was not preceded by a time of peace, but rather by the greatest war that has ever happened in human history. And only after this war, with millions of deaths and the development of unprecedented weapons of mass destruction, would we finally see some stability in the region. Amid all this, a clash erupted between Atlantic forces, or the British Empire, and the Eurasian force, the Russian Empire, which in this confrontation brought about the breakup of the Chinese and Ottoman Turkish empires and the fall of Eurasian power led the Russian Empire to cause political and military splits, resulting in radical groups and real warlords. Does this remind you of anything? If it doesn't, let me refresh your memory. The Middle East after the Iraq War in 2003, after the invasion of Iraq in 2003 by the United States, and 7 years later, the Arab Spring, authoritarian regimes or pseudo-state structures went into decline. First, it was Libya with Gaddafi, then Syria, breaking down with the civil war, which would finally collapse in 2025, and Iraq losing state coherence after the American occupation. And Lebanon still facing a true institutional collapse. The rise of perverse and radical groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State and the Taliban's retaking of Afghanistan made this context even worse. Iran, a central state in Eurasia, was greatly weakened by the defeats of its allies, Hezbollah and the Syrian government. So it remains an isolated bastion of stability in this turbulent sea of the Middle East. But even so, it is on the verge of facing the unprecedented consequences of the demographic crisis in the next decade. In addition to heavy pressure from hostile groups around its borders, it will probably become even more vulnerable in the coming decades. The government of Tehran will indeed face enormous challenges ahead to avoid its collapse, which will have an effect. Extremely destabilizing in the central region of Eurasia, probably spreading all this fury and instability throughout the entire continent. We had the fragmentation and multiplicity of armed actors inside Russia, Central Asia, and inland China. A post-imperial vacuum that brought warlords, military and political leaders based on regional militias. Today we have the equivalent of that in the Middle East. We have the proliferation of factions, as well as tribal structures and local networks. Each dominated territories, set their own laws, and negotiated with foreign powers. We also had the absence of a monopoly on violence in the region, fragmentation along ideological, religious, and ethnic lines with fluid alliances and frequent betrayals. That period I mentioned earlier, at the beginning of the 20th century, was marked by proxy wars among the powers that supported small nations, or these warlords as they needed. In Russia, from 1917 to 1922, the vacuum left by the collapse of the Tsarist regime led foreign powers to intervene directly, with Japan occupying Manchuria and part of Siberia. Meanwhile, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France even sent troops to support the anti-Bolshevik factions. Russian territory became a battleground for the global struggle between Western capitalism and communism, which was still in its infancy. An ideological conflict that transcended borders and would shape the rest of the century. And at that moment, communism would win. In China, between 1911 and 1928, Chinese fragmentation attracted Japan, which occupied territories in the north with Russia before breaking apart, also supporting revolutionary movements and Western powers, reinforcing their concessions over this shattered China. The conflicts between warlords. It was in part sustained by foreign capital and weaponry, turning China into a space of imperialist competition, where each power sought to leverage influence through these local factions. Between 1918 and 1924, external interventions directly shaped the Ottoman Empire's dissolution, with the United Kingdom and France imposing the Treaty of Sèvres and drawing new borders to suit their interests. They created artificial states in the Levant and the Mesopotamian area. In addition, Western and regional powers sponsored ethnic and nationalist groups such as Kurds, Arabs, and Armenians to weaken the old imperial structure. In fact, it was in this context that the Muslim Brotherhood was born, which would, decades later, foster even more extremist and radical groups that would result in Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. These proxy wars, with some states even being swallowed up by them, like the Russians, are very similar to what we're seeing again in the Middle East today. The pattern is repeating itself on a contemporary scale. Global powers like the United States and Russia, and regional ones like Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel have turned the Middle East into a battleground for proxy wars, with Syria and Iraq becoming the initial epicenter of this dispute, which will probably escalate. Just like Mongolia and Siberia were laboratories for military and political experiments after 1917. External actors fund local factions with money, weapons, and technology, prolonging conflicts and shaping the region. And in both periods, internal collapses did not result in isolation, but rather in intense foreign penetration. The transition zones became global arenas, where ideological and strategic disputes are fought over the ruins of former empires. In that period, the railway connections were a turning point in the unrest that led to this warlord caudillismo across the continent. Today, it's not the railway but the internet. And nowadays, with a clear difference. In the midst of that chaos, an atheist force emerged, filling the vacuum of that chaos that was the Soviet Union and, in the Chinese case, Communist China. But today is different. Today, the force that is emerging and could fill this vacuum is not atheist, but religious. Islamic extremism, this force, even though it is scattered, is the only force that exists throughout the entire region. So, every time you see someone celebrating the end of a dictatorship in the Eurasian region, remember history and, most importantly, look at which political groups are organized and have power in the region. You'll see that, in fact, the alternative to all these bad dictators are groups that are even more radical and worse. They seek to destroy all opposition, including Western forces. So don't assume that a dictator's fall will automatically bring prosperity, peace, and progress. Actually, history shows the opposite. Whenever these movements were too radical, what we saw was the result bringing consequences even worse than we could have imagined. So, be very careful with what you imagine and warn those friends of yours who get excited celebrating the fall of dictatorships. The world is much more complicated than just black and white, or, mainly, the world isn't just black and white. The world is divided into shades of gray, and those shades are becoming more and more similar to each other. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to share the video with everyone you know, because this kind of content doesn't have much public appeal. Your support is crucial for the Geopolitical Mundial channel's growth. And if you really like the channel and want to make sure it will keep existing, become a member. Not only will you get early access to this kind of video, but you'll also have access to exclusive series for members. Series that are more in-depth, more technical, and that you can't even find in other languages, and that are extremely valuable academically speaking. And you ensure Geopolitical Mundial exists. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it, and see you in the next video.